Hello to everyone, welcome to Chronobiology. This image on this first slide right here is actually a picture that I took at work. I work in a sleep lab, and that's my boss and I when we had to kind of reorganize the lab on a stressful night. So I watch people sleep for a living, basically. All right, moving on. So hi, I'm Mclaughlin. A lot of you have probably met me before, but if you haven't, I grew up in South Jersey and then I moved to Boston for school, and I still live in Boston. I studied neuroscience in school. I love neuroscience, absolutely. And I work as a sleep tech. So I watch people sleep, and that's a picture of kind of what my job is like, just hooking people up to a bunch of wires and tubes and things and seeing how they do during the night. And then a little bit more about me in the Splash world. So I actually attended Splash when I was a kid in high school, and it was the first time anybody ever taught me neuroscience in a classroom. And so ever since then, I've been teaching at Splash. I'm now actually a board member with Learning Unlimited that helps run programs like Rainstorm and other splashes. So I am one of the people that helps put on Rainstorm, and I'm really happy you guys are all here. I like to start off all my classes with learning goals or something pretentious like that. Basically, if you left the class and you didn't remember anything else I said, here's kind of what I want to stick. So first thing, this class is about chronobiology. We'll mostly be talking about circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms are kind of a subfield of chronobiology. I'll break that down in a second. But basically, you might think that they're just about your sleep-wake cycle, right? When you're asleep, when you're awake. They're not. They're about far, far, far more than that. They encompass every cell in your body and almost every function your body operates. Second thing, it's not necessarily fair to say that organisms evolved to have circadian rhythms. I would argue it's more fair to say that organisms evolved because of circadian rhythms. They are absolutely crucial to what it's like to live a life, any form of life on this planet that we're on. Third, circadian rhythms can run without any external influence. I'll talk about what that means more. But basically, in a vacuum, if you weren't exposed to the environment whatsoever, your physiology would still be able to conduct these rhythms within you. All right, cool. So moving on. And if you joined after I sent those links, ask one of your fellow friends to send them to you. So breaking down a few terms that we'll talk about a lot. Circadian rhythm, it comes from the Latin circa diem, which means about a day, so about 24 hours. And then chronobiology, circadian rhythms are something that we study within the field of chronobiology, which means the time of life, the rhythms of life. So biological clocks and anything that's short, long, medium, in between, all of that kind of time cycles. So now the question is, why 24 hours? Why is that such a hot subject in chronobiology? And it's just some space stuff. It's just some physics things that I don't really understand. But basically, the Earth takes 24 hours to spin around. And as a biologist, that's all I need to know. So that's 24 hours. That's how long the Earth takes to spin around. And so that's how long we are facing the sun or facing away from the sun. And we have a light-dark cycle on Earth of 24 hours. Okay, everybody enter in the chat. I see some numbers appearing on the Jamboard, but I want everyone to play this quiz show game with me. Which of these things on the screen has a circadian rhythm? I'm gonna wait to see some answers roll in the chat. All of them, everything. Some people are just saying the fourth thing. Number 3. All right, so you guys who said all of them would be correct. It was a trick question if you tilt your head upside down. I put the spoiler on the slide. Everything on this slide has a circadian rhythm. We're going to talk about how that works for each of them as we move forward. But first, I want to share some examples of circadian rhythms in different species. So first, we're going to talk about zooplankton. They're very, very, very tiny. And actually, they live at the bottom of the ocean, normally. The problem is they can't really eat at the bottom of the ocean. It's really good for them to be at the bottom of the ocean because the predators on the surface, like whales or whatever, can't eat them. But they need to eat at the top because they need to be able to see the sun to eat. At the bottom of the ocean, there's no sun. So what they actually do is every day, they migrate from the bottom of the ocean up to the top of the ocean. And this is actually the largest coordinated biomass migration on the planet, which means that it's the most life moving at once, and it happens every single day. And so you can see on this map of the ocean, wherever those red heat spots are, that's where the largest concentration of the plankton is. And so about the same time every day, they move from the bottom up to the top. And that's kind of incredible when you think about it, right? Because they're not all able to check the watch and see, oh, the sunset. Because at the bottom of the ocean, it's dark. They don't know if the sun is up or down, right? But they still all know when to move up at night so that they're lesser threatened by predators. And so how do they do that, right? They do that because their bodies have an innate circadian rhythm inside them. And then on the right, we're looking at a species of rabbits, hares. And these guys, when they're babies, they all need to eat from mom, right? They need to nurse from mom. But the thing about this species is it'd be really dangerous if during the day, all of the babies hid in the same place. Because then if a predator finds the nest, the predator finds all the babies. So during the day, they all go and they hide in separate places. But at sunset, right after, they need to come find mom to eat. But the sunset time changes every day. It gets earlier and earlier during, the different seasons, or later and later. And so actually, they're all able to know when it's about half an hour after sunset to come to their spot and come looking for mom from all of their separate places. But again, they're not checking their watch, right? They can't just pull out their phone and say, oh, it's 7:30, it's time to go eat from mom. But their circadian rhythms are able to inform that time for them. And there's a bunch of cool behaviors in circadian rhythms, from birds and the bees. It's a kind of funny joke, the birds and the bees in chronobiology. But basically, all of these things have circadian rhythms that dictate all of these different behaviors. So I want you to think about chronobiology at large, right? Think not over the course of a day, but over months or a year or different seasons. I want you to think about this deer right here, right? What kinds of behaviors or characteristics about this deer change over the course of a year or the course of months? Feel free to add into the chat box whatever you can come up with. Is the spinach in a plant, or is it separate? Spinach is a plant, but I was also kind of representing plants. Yeah, antlers, that's a great example of one. So they grow their antlers longer, or their antlers aren't growing depending on what season. Migratory patterns, that's a great one. And when you think about why deer would need to migrate, right? We're thinking about weather, we're thinking about cold. So yeah, that's a great reason why they would need some sort of time in their body over the course of a year. Body mass, right? You would want to have more during the winter when it's cold, when the light is shorter and you can't hunt as much. Hibernation, mating season, that's a perfectly great one. There's evolutionary advantage to breeding their young during certain seasons of the year, right? Changing fur color, that is another great one, right? So deer, they are more camouflaged in the winter versus the summer, right? Their coat is lighter. And so there's got to be something biological making that happen, changing the color of their fur, right? Telling their cells to produce different proteins differently. Length of coat, that's another great one. Yep, you guys have come up with a bunch of great chronobiological behaviors or characteristics that are longer than a day. Now, can anybody think of maybe in humans, something that lasts shorter than a day, something that's not a circadian rhythm? We actually have different words for these things. There's ultradian and infradian rhythms, right? So longer than a day, shorter than a day. Think about something that takes about a month, or think about something that happens maybe once or twice a minute. Yep, hibernation and health, definitely. And the reason why that this is important is because there's great evolutionary advantage to these things happening. Yeah, insomnia, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about different stuff like that. Yeah, menstrual cycles, periods, thank you for entering that. That is a great example of a biological cycle that happens in people and humans that takes longer than a day, right? It's about a monthly cycle. And so that is also a chronobiological process. Can anybody think of anything that's maybe shorter than a day? And again, that hint is maybe once a minute or twice a minute, things that happen kind of cyclically, rhythmically, right? So if I were to breathing, yeah, blinking even to some degree. Yep, breathing, pulse, yes. So your heartbeat and your respiration. These are important rhythmic biological qualities that your body uses these rhythms to regulate. Hunger and digestion. We're going to talk a whole lot about how appetite and the food you eat and when you eat it affects your circadian rhythm. So going forward, mostly going to be focusing on circadian rhythms. But first, I want to jump back to that worm that I showed you. This is called the Atlantic fireworm. And yes, it does have daily rhythms, but it also has, interestingly, a month-long rhythm, so longer than circadian. And that has to do with its reproductive cycle. Interestingly, it's timed to the moon. Now, I'm going to give you a little hint, and I want you to try to guess why this might be evolutionarily advantageous for this worm to have a reproductive cycle timed with the moon. So this worm, it doesn't live on land. It lives in the water, and it reproduces in the water. And yes, tides, thank you. That is exactly why this is important. Lighting is somewhat important, and that's going to be regulated more by the circadian rhythm. It's also, of course, got a lot to do with the lunar cycle. If the moon is bigger, there's more light. Yeah, protection, right? So we're thinking about how these things are evolutionarily advantageous. So it's helpful for these guys to breed their young when the tides are a certain way versus, a less advantageous way. All right, now we're going to talk about plants a little bit. So plants have circadian rhythms. On the left, we're looking at a cool study that was done where they went to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's and they bought a ton of different salad greens. So they bought kale, cabbage, lettuce, spinach. They really left no hole unturned. And what they did is they kept them under different lighting conditions. So in chronobiology, if you see LD, that means that the organism is subject to a light-dark cycle, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark. If you see LL, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of light, all light. If you see DD, constant dark, right? And on the fourth column, you can see that it was a dark, dark condition, but in a refrigerator, so at 4 degrees Celsius. And what their hypothesis was is that plants have circadian rhythms. We know this, and I'll talk about how we know that in a second. But how does that affect how these vegetables rot, right? How does it affect shelf life of these vegetables? And so what you're looking at is you're trying to see when these vegetables are most green, right? And so when you see that these vegetables are most green, that is when their circadian rhythms are conferring them the most advantage to not rotting, not going bad. And so what you can actually see, especially if you look at the spinach on the bottom, is that the spinach did just as well in a 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark cycle as it did in the refrigerator, kept cold with dark. And as you can see, the cabbage in the second row, when it was not exposed to any light, either in the refrigerator or in the dark, it got really white. So its cells started to degrade, right? And on the right, this is actually a really old experiment done where plants, they like to bloom. They like to open their petals and their leaves at different hours of the day. And they know how to do that because their circadian rhythm helps inform when that is. And so actually, there was a garden planted, and I believe it was by Linnaeus, who was a biologist. And at each different sector of the garden, a different flower bloomed, was open at that time of the day. So it was kind of like a garden clock. Now, going back to plants, this was actually one of the first ways that we learned that circadian rhythms exist and are important and exist within life. So what they actually did, and it's a real high-tech experiment, is they took a pen and they took a string and they tied the pen to the leaves of the plant with a string. Because basically they had noticed that during the night, the leaves were kind of droopy, and during the day, the leaves were kind of open and up, ready to absorb the sun. And so when they tied the pen to these leaves, what they saw is every night, the leaves kind of got lower, right? So the leaves kind of drooped down. And you can see in this graph right here that it kind of looks like, if you guys have taken pre-calc before, trigonometry, a sine wave or a sinusoidal curve. Yeah, so I had mentioned ultradian and infradian rhythms. So those are longer or shorter than a day. So it looks like a sine wave or a sinusoidal curve. That's something that kind of goes like this, right? It oscillates. And what's important is that those leaves are lowering or rising depending on what the light conditions are outside or the time of day. So what researchers did is they decided, let's turn out the lights and see if this still happens. So at about where I have it marked, you can see that there's no longer white, it's all gray hashed out, and that's when the plant was not exposed to any light. And in chronobiology, we call this a free running period. A free running period is when an organism has no external environmental cues telling its circadian rhythm when to happen or what to do. It's all just existing on its own accord, its own biology. And so what you can see is the plant still had its leaves rising and falling, right? It petered out a little bit towards the end, so it was weaker without having some sort of influence, but it still did it. And that means that the circadian rhythm isn't just, a stimulus from the environment. It exists within the organism. And then getting back to bacteria, believe it or not, you are kind of 10 times more bacteria than you are you, which is kind of a scary thought. And actually, if I were to take your whole body and I were to measure all of the DNA in your body, 200 times more of it would be bacterial DNA than your DNA. This is called the microbiome. It helps regulate digestion and the conditions of your skin and things all around your body. And so it's actually kind of like 5 pounds of you, depending on how much you weigh. And bacteria definitely have a circadian rhythm. Not only do you affect your microbiome circadian rhythm, but it can affect yours. And now we're getting onto this guy. He doesn't have eyes, right? Which is kind of crazy because we keep talking about light. And if he doesn't have eyes and he lives underground, how is it possible that he has a circadian rhythm, right? Well, actually, he has a part of the eye still there, even though he doesn't have the full eye. And this part of your eye is called the retina. We'll talk about that a little bit because it's a really important body part when we're talking about chronobiology. So the retina senses light. And because this guy can sense light, he can entrain to a circadian rhythm. So let's talk about entrainment. Let's define that word. Entrainment is whenever an organism's circadian rhythm adjusts to its environment because there's some type of cue. Usually that cue is light. So if the sun is up or if artificial lights are on, something like that. And it's not just all light, it's particular wavelengths of light. And what we really want to hone in on is blue light. So your retina senses those blue wavelengths of light. It then sends those signals via a special optic tract to your suprachiasmatic nucleus. Your eyes at some point go into your brain that kind of cross over, and that's called the optic chiasm. Supra means under. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which I'll call the SCN going forward, it just lives right under that optic chiasm. And that is the master controller. I kind of like to use the example that, and maybe this is a little out of date in the smartphone age, but imagine that we were all standing under Big Ben. We were all going to go on a scavenger hunt in London. We all had our watches, right? It's kind of like if we all were to set our watches to something, and so we all set them to the really big clock, Big Ben, so they were all synced up, right? So the SCN in this example is Big Ben, and all of your cells are us with our watches. And so Big Ben, or the SCN, is telling all of your body's cells how to sync up their rhythm together. And so those rhythms, they go all throughout your body, literally every cell in your body, the SCN kind of influences. And it also influences parts of your body like the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin that you might have seen at the drugstore. You might be taking yourselves to help sleep. Now I want to talk about another really early study in chronobiology. So this is an experiment where a guy named Nathaniel Kleitman, he was a professor, he was like, I want to live in a cave for a month. Not really, he wanted to investigate circadian rhythms, but I like my version better. So he went and he spent a month living in a cave with some of his research assistants. And they had this idea, and their idea was that the human 24-hour clock was arbitrary, right? It doesn't have, it didn't form for any particular reason. That's just how it is because that's how long the Earth takes to spin. So he thought that it could be modified. So it could be turned into a 20-hour clock or a 28-hour clock. Now the results that he got suggested completely otherwise. It said that our clock is 24 hours, is 24 hours, is 24 hours, nothing else matters. And he was one of kind of the first people to research circadian rhythms. No one was really doing it before him. So here are his results, right? So they're living in a cave and there are no lights in this cave. That's important. And what they measured is they measured body temperature. Your body temperature is actually an output of your circadian rhythm. It changes throughout the day, just like whether you're asleep or awake or hungry or anything does, right? And so we all know that our body temperature should be about 98.6 degrees, right? But actually your body temperature is the highest during midday. So think like noon, and your body temperature is the lowest right when you should be sleeping. And that's how your body helps tell you, hey man, we need to be asleep, right? So let's look in the middle. We can see this graph right here that their body temperature was lowest in those hashed out periods. That's sleep time. So every 16 hours, they were supposed to be asleep for 8 hours, and they don't have watches, they don't have lights, they're just living in a cave, right? But on the top, what they try to do is say, okay, how about instead of sleeping every 24 hours, we're going to go to sleep every 21 hours. And so they tried to impose that sleep schedule on us, that every 21 hours, we're going to sleep for 8 hours. And so what you can see is gradually as this experiment went on, of course, in the beginning, their body temperature was lowest while they were asleep. But as it goes on, their body temperature is now lowest when they're in midday, right? Especially look at the end of that first row. And then on the bottom, they did the same thing, but let's sleep every 28 hours. And what you can see is instead of going forward, that lowest point of body temperature, or instead of going backwards, it goes forwards, right? So now instead of that body temperature being lowest right when they're asleep, it's lowest at the end of when they're supposed to be asleep or during the middle of the day, right? And so what this showed is that our body's rhythms are 24 hours, and that's just kind of what happens. It's biologically caused. It doesn't have to do with the environment, but it can be influenced by the environment. So again, this is entrainment. This is adjusting in response to a cue. And here's some examples of experiments. I have a question in the chat. Jen is asking me, how does natural light versus synthetic light affect circadian rhythms? And this is really important because in research, we don't use natural light mostly, right? If we're in a lab, we're using synthetic light. And the answer is that it depends on how bright the light is, and it depends on what wavelengths of light are being put out by that light. So we'll talk about screens that you have in front of you and what kind of lights are really good at that blue light, because your body is just really looking for those blue wavelengths of light. So these were examples done in rodents. On the left, we have a diurnal or daytime living animal. And every time you see the black, that's when that animal is awake and moving around. And whenever you don't see any black, it's asleep. And so what we did here is we just exposed it to 1 hour of light every day at the same time every day. And you can see that it doesn't really need any more than that. It knows that its activity is kind of starting right after that light is arising. So that light kind of represents dawn. Now on the right, we're not looking at a diurnal animal, we're looking at a nocturnal animal. And so you can see that its activity is highest during the night, right? And so now what we did here is every 15-30 minutes, we administered that 1 hour of synthetic light, that 1 hour of blue wavelength light pulse, a little bit earlier every day. And what you can see is it actually started sleeping earlier and being awake later, or earlier, sorry. And so its circadian rhythm was moving forward in response to the environment. Now, I've told you two things about the circadian rhythm so far. I've told you both that it's rigid and that it's flexible. So let's try to brainstorm some ideas in the chat of why each of those things are important, right? Why is it important that our circadian rhythms are stable, that they can operate without any external influence? Why is it important that they can change, that they can entrain to our environment? And we want to think in the context of evolutionary advantage. How does this help us? Yeah, Matthew said survival. How does it help us survive? I'm gonna take a sip of water while you guys think and add some things in the chat. Season changes. That is a great idea, Gideon. Yeah. So the Earth, right? We spin around every day, but we also are revolving around the sun, right? And so because of that, days have different lengths depending on what season we're in, what time of the year it is. And so it's really important that an organism can adjust to having, length of daylight. Thanks, Russell. It's really important that we can adjust to either having 12 hours of light in a day Or think about like Iceland or Alaska, right? Maybe not having light during the day. Yep, adapting to different environments. Yep, that is super important. And that's why circadian rhythms being both stable but also flexible and adaptable really benefit us. So we've been talking about artificial light a little bit. Basically, you have to imagine circadian rhythms evolving before we had all of this crazy technology, right? So when the only light source on Earth was the sun and these bacteria were evolving these cycles, you can imagine how that worked out. And then, of course, we humans got pretty smart and full of ourselves, and we started inventing things like fire and technology, and then the Industrial Revolution happened, and all of a sudden we have electricity, and we can have the lights on whenever we want, right? And so that hasn't necessarily been great for our circadian rhythms. And I want to talk about the Industrial Revolution for a second. It's kind of funny. So I do sleep apnea research. I watch people sleep all night. But if I had lived during the Industrial Revolution, my job title wouldn't be sleep tech. My job title would be knocker upper. And that's who I would be. See at the bottom left. So in the Industrial Revolution, now that we have these light bulbs, these lights on, people could work in the factories all day long. They didn't need to work just during the day, right? They could work at 3 a.m., 2 a.m., it doesn't matter. And so people needed to be able to be woken up to get to work. So we'll talk about chronotype in a bit, but you would take people who had really long chronotypes and they would go throughout the town at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and they would take a giant pole and they would knock on the windows of the bedrooms of everybody in town that needed to go to work and wake them up, because we didn't have alarm clocks, right? Now, of course, we have alarm clocks, but we also have screens that are very, very good at putting blue light wavelengths directly into your eyes. And so your circadian rhythm can kind of falsely entrain to those wavelengths, right? It's not necessarily the best thing, but it happens to us. And so that's why you'll see people talking about night shift mode on your phone or flux on your computer to mitigate how much of that blue wavelength light is being broadcast to your eyes. We're going to do a case study now. And I want you guys to try to guess in the chat what you think is happening with our case study. So we have a patient, and the patient complains that they cannot sleep until the sun rises. It doesn't matter what time they get in bed, early, late, doesn't matter. Until the sun rises, they can't fall asleep. When the patient has no obligations the next day, like occupational or social, the patient can fall asleep at 7 a.m. without any issue and can wake up at 3 p.m. without any issue. If the patient has to wake up before 3 p.m., however, they feel lethargic and they feel exhausted. What's wrong with our patient? Let's start looking into this. So first we need to understand that sleep is regulated by two processes in your body. Now, of course, we're going to be mostly talking about the circadian rhythm aspect here, but it's also regulated by a process H, and that's your sleep homeostat. Homeostasis is a biological phenomenon where your body just kind of wants to keep things equal, at equilibrium. It wants things to be stable. So if you have an influence that's up here, your body's going to try to bring it back there to match normal conditions, match being stable. And so your process H works through adenosine. So comment in the chat if you're like me and you've consumed some sort of caffeinated beverage today. How caffeine actually works is it blocks your body from collecting adenosine. Adenosine, over the course of a day, kind of builds and builds and builds in your body. And when there's just a lot of it, your body goes, oh man, we need to go to sleep. It tells you we're tired, right? So coffee, caffeine, it works by preventing the buildup of adenosine. It kind of says, hey, we're gonna ignore this for a little bit. And it promotes wakefulness that way. You also have a circadian rhythm drive, and that goes up and down like a sine wave or a sinusoidal curve throughout the day. And so these are the two processes that work together, where in most people at around 11 p.m., there's so much of this pressure and so much of that pressure, and they're saying, we need to go to sleep right now. Now, the thing about the patient is it seems that we're not dealing with the sleep homeostat. It seems like we're dealing with the circadian rhythm, because the patient can go to bed at a certain time with no problem. So they can sleep and wake up. It's just the timing that's messed up. So the patient Googles, why can't I sleep until the sun rises? And we get some results here. So first result, we get circadian sleep disorders network. Okay, that kind of confirms that we're talking about that process C, right? Second article, are you a night owl? Well, maybe that sounds like something that's right. Humans have a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, okay, circadian rhythm stuff, and we see these letters DSPD. I'm assuming that our third result, delayed sleep phase disorder, is what that stands for. Interesting. Let's look into that. So first we need to understand that circadian rhythms kind of anchor at certain points of the day, right? So let's imagine a normal person, a person who sleeps and wakes up at normal times, right? So not our patient. And let's imagine that their circadian rhythm anchors at this point on the clock arbitrarily. And now we're imagining what goes into it. Your circadian rhythm is affected by so many things. It's affected by if the sun's up, what your body temperature is, are you tired, when did you eat, what did you eat, what are your bacteria up to? All of these things. It's like a spider web of influences, inputs and outputs. And here are some of those, right? So again, and I didn't even mention melatonin. Is your body secreting melatonin? And oh, your genes, right? What proteins is your body secreting, and everything like that. Now, our patient's circadian rhythm is kind of not anchored at that point at the day, as we see through their sleep-wake cycle. It's kind of anchored at a shifted part of the day. And this is what delayed sleep phase disorder is. It's a delayed phase, so that's the kind of anchor time, right? So is, does the beginning of sleep start at 10 p.m. or at 7 a.m., right? So we look at one point and it's delayed. And so again, to explain kind of those inputs and outputs, so we imagine a normal person, right? And so melatonin, your body has the most melatonin secreted while you're asleep. And if you are that normal person, when you wake up, the sun rises in your subjective morning, your subjective wake up time, and your body temperature is at its highest midday, so about noon. And so we can kind of imagine this sine wave of the rise and fall of your different circadian processes. But we're looking at this patient now where their melatonin still peaks during the time that they're asleep, and their body temperature is still highest midday. It's just their subjective midday. It's not noon anymore. It's delayed. But the sun is not rising during their subjective morning. Their subjective, we just wake up. It's rising during their subjective evening. So 3 p.m., 7 p.m., things like that, right? So all of the circadian processes are happening. They're just delayed. They're shifted. And we can see this if we were to look at melatonin secretion in our controls and in our delayed sleep phase disorder patients. So in the white circles, you can see that these are the different concentrations of melatonin in the body at different times of day. And then in our dark circles, we can see what these melatonin concentrations look like for our patient. And it's the same kind of amplitude, right? It still gets about as high and about as low. It's just happening at a different time of the day. This is a circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder. There are two kinds of circadian rhythm disorders. The first kind is extrinsic. So that means that the disorder is happening not necessarily because of biology. Biology is considered kind of normal, but because of some effect that the environment is imposing. And so the first example of one of these is shift work disorder. So this occurs when people have to go to work at night and their body just does not adjust to that well. It's very difficult, and they have all these health problems or sleep problems or cognitive problems because of it. The second extrinsic circadian rhythm disorder is jet lag disorder. And this is for anybody who's ever taken a flight. Definitely, if you've taken a long flight, ever experienced jet lag, feel free to share in the comments. You might have felt nauseous, you might have felt tired, you might have felt like you woke up on Mars or got run over by a train. And it's because that is just such a long jump for your body's circadian rhythm to adjust to. So that's an extrinsic circadian rhythm disorder. Then we have intrinsic circadian rhythm disorders, and delayed sleep phase disorder is one of those. We also have the opposite of delayed sleep phase disorder, which is basically instead of someone waking up later, they're waking up earlier, and this is advanced sleep phase disorder. We also have one more that's a little bit more complicated. This is what happens if that 24-hour number breaks down completely, and somebody's working on a 26-hour circadian rhythm, for example. So instead of falling asleep every 24 hours, they're falling asleep every 26 hours. for example. And this is called non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder. And it most commonly happens in 3 groups of people, but can happen in other groups of people as well. The first group is people who are autistic. And this is something that we see primarily in children around the time when they would be adjusting to waking up during the day and sleeping at night, that instead of doing that, they're waking up every 26 hours. The second group of people we see this in is the blind. And we hypothesize that this has something to do with their visual tract just being different, right? Their eyes just aren't as good at sensing the light that entrains their body. The third group of people that we see non-24-hour in commonly is people who suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's. And that has to do with the different parts of your brain cells kind of attacking your brain cells and breaking that down. And we see non-24-hour in many other groups of people. Modern research hypothesizes that it is the same disorder as bipolar disorder. And so we see it in a lot of different groups of people. All right, now we're going to shift back to extrinsic circadian rhythm disorders for a second. And we're going to talk about shift work in particular. And so you usually think of circadian rhythms and you just think it's about sleep and it's about waking up, but it's so much more than that. So shift workers is a big chunk of Americans. It's maybe about 17% of Americans. And these are jobs like security guards, people like me who watch people sleep, right? And we have shown that shift workers are susceptible to so many diseases. They're susceptible to diabetes due to weakened insulin resistance. People with circadian rhythm disorders can even get a 3rd type of diabetes. They're more susceptible to Alzheimer's, dementia, or other neurodegenerative issues, impaired brain functioning. They're more susceptible to cardiovascular disease, having cholesterol problems, or high blood pressure. They're more susceptible to cancer because their body's hormones are at different times of day than they should be, and they have less hormonal protection against cancer. These people are more likely to be obese. They're more likely to smoke cigarettes or be addicted to tobacco. There are different effects that this can have on neurochemistry. They're more likely to have mood disorders like depression or anxiety disorders. People who are shift workers are also more likely to have GI issues, so ulcers, constipation, IBS, heartburn. They're more likely to have complications with fertility. Some people struggle to get pregnant. Some people struggle to stay pregnant. This is a mind-blowing list of problems that I just told you 17% of Americans are more susceptible to just because they're fighting their body's circadian rhythm. And yeah, I really like the example that Siva, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, shared in the chat of this is a phenotype that we might see in an autistic adult and sleep disordered. It doesn't really function as we would expect it to. So yeah, altered sleep-wake cycles. So I don't know if any of you guys attended Firestorm, but we're going to talk about jet lag poop for a hot minute. So researchers did this fun experiment where they took the poop from jet-lagged people and they put it into mice that had no bacteria in their body. This is called fecal transplantation. And so they took the people, they jet-lagged the people, then they took the poop out of the people and they put it into the mice. And what they looked at is, did these mice become obese? And it turns out the mice who got the poop from the jet-lagged people got more obese. You can see this red line in figure CD, right? You're looking at it and 2 stars in science means that it's a really significant result, that this is really not something that we would have expected to happen with our controls. And so the mice with the jet-lagged poop, or the bacteria from the jet-lagged poop, had more propensity to getting obese than the normal poop mice. And then indeed, at the bottom, we're looking, what they did is instead of putting poop in mice, they injected cancer into mice. And then they jet-lagged the mice. So they did 8-hour shifts every 3 days. That's about the equivalent of if you flew from, I'm in Boston, it'd be like if I flew to Poland or something, every 3 days. And so what they saw after they injected these cancerous cells into the mice lungs is that the jet-lagged mice got worse cancer. They developed bigger cancer, bigger tumors after 13 weeks of this. And now we're like, oh my God, messing with your circadian rhythm is so bad. Look what happened to these poor mice. They got obese, they got lung cancer. Jeez, did they die? Oh, sad fact about biological research is all mice used in biological research die. We call that sacrificing the mice. So yeah, they died. Sorry to break that news to you. Does anybody have any other questions so far? Feel free to turn on your mic if you want to ask me out loud. So yeah, these circadian rhythms affect every cell in your body. Sleep apnea is not quite circadian rhythm related. It has to do with breathing more so than anything else. If you want to stick around, I can answer more sleep apnea questions because it's my job. So every cell in your body is affected by your circadian rhythms, but only your brain is able to sense light, right? So how does that work? Yeah, you can change your circadian rhythm and stay healthy. There are slow ways to do it. Some people have more flexibility about their circadian rhythms than others. So we talked about that SCN earlier, right? And the SCN is that master controller. It's a group of neurons that just all work together to accomplish one goal. And that goal is to tell your body, hey, let's all sync our circadian rhythms to these times. And they work by working together. So in this experiment on the left, they took a slice of tissue from the SCN and they measured its circadian rhythm. You can see that all the reds line up and all the greens line up. And on the right side of this figure, instead, they took just one neuron here and there from different parts of the SCN. And they measured those dispersed neurons. And what you see is that the reds don't line up and the greens line up. So what this tells us is that the SCN is just a bunch of cells working together, kind of crowdsourcing, hey man, this is going to be our circadian rhythm. It's a cell friendship. Now, I told you that circadian rhythms happen in every cell in your body, this gene expression cycle. And so period 1, period 3, cryptochrome 1, cryptochrome 2, or per1, cry1, these are different clock genes. And what they did here is they measured the secretion of these clock genes, these proteins. And on the left, we're looking at that SCN, that Big Ben clock in your body, and you see that beautiful sinusoidal wave, right? And on the right, we took cells from your lungs. And what you can see at the top, and this is wild type or our control, so you can see that we have that curve, right? Like it's doing pretty good. And they took these cells out of the body and they measured how its circadian rhythm is doing. But once they took the lung cells out of the body, they weren't able to maintain their circadian rhythms themselves. The SCN was. So basically what this tells us is that your peripheral cells, all of the cells throughout your body, they need the SCN to help keep it straight, help keep it synced up, tell it what to do. So again, just a little summary. The SCN is that master controller, that master clock, and it goes and it tells your body when to sync its circadian rhythms up, all of your cells. This affects your body temperature, when your body is resting versus active, and it tells you when to eat, when not to eat. It affects your hormones, it affects how your body metabolizes food, and it affects your nervous system, and a lot of things, right? It helps control everything in your body. So the molecular basis of all of this is essentially just a loop, right? So your genes make proteins, those proteins turn the genes off. Genes make proteins, proteins bind to the DNA, turn the genes off. 1, 2, 1, 2. And this cycle takes 24 hours, about, in most people. And that's how our cells have their own circadian rhythms kind of built into them. It's kind of like each one of our cells, this gene process, this molecular process is like a watch in each of our cells. And so now I'm going to show you guys a brief video just kind of explaining how that works with some pictures.
The purrs and cries. And so what we have
here
hear are BMAL clock, which is the positive activators of actually a set of at least 5 genes. All 3 PERP genes and both cryptochrome genes appear to be under the regulation of clock based on genetic experiments.
So per, cry, BMAL, clock,
these
are all
are
different clock genes.
Activators of all of these proteins. To simplify the animation, we've reduced it to just period and cryptochrome.
Period and cryptochrome.
And as we saw in Drosophila, what happens is once the period and cryptochrome.
Right here, what you're seeing is after period and cryptochrome make their thing, they find each other and they hold hands. They do something called dimerize. Dimerizing is when proteins hold hands. They then go back into
Chrome
the
genes are
nucleus.
turned on, their RNAs accumulate, proteins are made, but in this case, a number of different dimer combinations can be formed. Per dimers, cryptochrome per dimers, and different combinations of the various per and cryptochrome proteins.
And right here in blue and green, you can see that BMAL and clock are activators. They tell the DNA, hey, make the period and cryptochrome RNA. But when these proteins get made and they hold hands, they go back into the nucleus, they attach to BMAL and clock, and they say, hey, we're going to stop making period and cryptochrome. And then at some point they degrade, your body breaks them down and they go away. And then your genes start making that mRNA again. And this is how that cycle happens in your cells, and it takes 24 hours and it happens in all of your cells. It's just your SCN is the best at it.
The PERS and
so again, here's a visual of what that process looks like. And yeah, it takes about 1 day in most people, 24 hours. Actually, this was discovered at the sleep department at the hospital that I work at, Brigham and Women's, and within my lifetime too. So yeah, this is like the watch, the gears of the watch in each of your cells. It's, you know, genes get made, they go tell the genes to stop, they go away. Genes get made, you know, things like that, right? And so here you can see a really good example of how that kind of rises and falls over 24 hours. This experiment was really cool. They basically used fluorescence to make these cells that are expressing these proteins glow. And so you can see it gets brighter at some point and then it gets dimmer. That means that there's more of them present in the nucleus or in the cell, and then there's less of them present in the nucleus in the cell. And again, we're looking at period and cryptochrome, per and cry again here. And so, yeah, this is actually like a video that they took of these glowing cells in tissue from mice SCNs. Now I want to pivot to a really cool study. This study came out in 2013, and this is one of the studies that super directed me towards chronobiology. So I'm going to talk about these figures right here. So here's what happened. We had people, the people died, we got the brains from the people. Okay. So when we got the brains from the people, we took slices from different parts of the brains and we sequenced the expression of different clock proteins, clock genes, right? And what the scientists then tried to do is, not having written down what the time of death of the person's brain was, they tried to use how those clock genes look, right? Which ones are there, which ones aren't there, how much of the different clock genes are there, to predict what time that person with that brain had died at. And what you see on the left is, in the controls, they were really, really good at doing that. The straighter a line is from the inside of the circle to the outside, the better they were at taking how much they were expressing all of these clock genes, these clock proteins, and predicting what time that brain had died at based on how much of them there are. But then they took patients with major depressive disorder who also donated their brains to this experiment. And what you see on the right is they were really bad at predicting when these people had died. So, you know, they got a brain and they were looking at it and they were like, hey, with how these genes and proteins look, we think this person died at 11 a.m. and this person died at 3 p.m., right? They were just not good at it. So this tells us that maybe there's a circadian component to mood disorder, right? Maybe this being messed up has something to do with the emergence of that mood disorder phenotype. All right, now we're going to look at the MEQ. I see for some reason you guys have been putting them upside down. I don't really know how to explain that, but basically looking at the MEQ, and then we think about kind of what the scale is. We would expect, because you guys are adolescents, that you guys aim more towards eveningness. Now, what we're seeing here is you guys actually all aim more towards morningness, which is actually a very unexpected result when we're polling adolescents, people in your age group, because hormones kind of play a role in circadian rhythms, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you guys are all special snowflakes compared to the average teenager, basically. So this is a measure of chronotype, and chronotype is one's natural inclination to time of day. So we would say that our patient with delayed sleep phase disorder has an evening chronotype, right? Whereas someone who likes to wake up at 5 a.m. has a morning chronotype. Adolescents usually have evening chronotypes, whereas people who are seniors usually have morning chronotypes. They like to wake up earlier. And this is because of the different hormones that happen throughout your body over the course of life. Think about puberty, things like that. And I put where we are. So yeah, we're there. We're, you know, between the ages of 13 and 23 over here. And yeah, that's kind of what's going on with us. Most of us like to wake up at night, except most of you kind of don't. So thanks for proving science wrong, guys. So these clock genes are actually highly heritable. Heritability is an estimate of how likely is this caused by genes versus by the environment. And we do a lot of twin studies to learn about this stuff. So basically, your parents' chronotype, you kind of have a 50% chance of inheriting it, is what that measure is of. So now if I just told you that circadian rhythms are usually later in teenagers, and I told you that, you know, all of these problems that people have when they oppose their natural circadian rhythm or they mess those up, what do you guys think about school? Definitely head on over to the second page of our Jamboard and share your thoughts just as we end out the class, right? Do you think that what we're doing is dangerous? Are there biological repercussions to opposing someone's natural circadian rhythm? But we're going to move on a little bit. We're going to talk about the phase response curve really quick. The phase response curve is something in chronobiology that basically says if we were to give someone a light pulse now, expose them to light now, would it delay or extend or advance their circadian rhythm, right? Their chronotype. And so what we see is that whenever someone is exposed to light at night, you can look under the line at the bottom, the negative numbers here, that light exposed to at night, subjective night, will delay your circadian rhythm. Basically what this means is if you should be asleep and you're on a screen with blue light in your eyes, that's going to delay your circadian rhythm and make it harder for you to get to sleep early going forward. Whereas you can see that if you're exposed to light kind of at the latter half of your night, then it will advance your circadian rhythm. It'll make it easier to wake up early. Is there a way to reset your circadian rhythm? There is not, to some extent. There are ways to modify it and adapt it and entrain it, but your circadian rhythm is determined by kind of how long your clock genes take to do their thing, how long that watch takes to spin the gears. So it's people with earlier or evening chronotypes have longer molecular clocks, and people with, I'll get to a slide on this in a second. So yeah, basically if you're exposed to light when you should be sleeping, it can delay your circadian rhythm. And if you're exposed to light kind of really early in the day, it will help advance your circadian rhythm. So it's like waking up early helps you wake up earlier, and going to bed later only makes it harder to go to bed going forward. So I was just mentioning, basically that morningness eveningness questionnaire, that chronotype actually corresponds to how long that molecular clock takes. So I told you in an average person, it takes about 24 hours. But if we're looking at our extrinsic circadian rhythm disorders, people with advanced sleep phase disorder or extreme early birds, they actually have shorter periods of their molecular clock. It takes closer to 23 hours. And our case study, people with strong evening chronotypes or delayed sleep phase disorder, it has the molecular clock has a greater than 24-hour cycle. It's actually closer to 25. So basically what's happening is their molecular clock is taking too long, and that's having a delaying effect on their circadian rhythm, which has a lot to do with how this phase response curve interacts with it. But we're not going to do any calculus or anything here. So let's get back to our case study. We're looking at this here. This is a log of when our patient was asleep and when our patient was awake over a 6-month time period. So the dark is when our patient is asleep. And feel free to share in the chat what you're noticing about the data. Feel free to interpret it. What are you seeing? What time is our patient usually going to sleep? What time is our patient going to bed? People with circadian rhythm disorders, there are a bunch of different options. The first option is obviously to try to break bread with your circadian rhythm and use light therapy and melatonin. Your body secretes melatonin naturally, but you can take it exogenously, or you can buy a pill bottle at the store. And so that's one option. And in fact, light therapy, like I told you about mood disorders, there's a lot of overlap with circadian rhythms. So light therapy is also used to treat different mood disorders. But people with extreme circadian rhythm disorders, it's not enough anymore. And so there's really nothing to do to directly address it. You just have to go to pharmacology, so drugs, right? So I don't know if you guys have necessarily pieced this together yet, but I am the case study. That is me. That is 6 months of my sleep data. And when I was in high school, I was, legally prescribed amphetamines to wake up every day, and a sleeping pill to go to bed every night, right? So yeah, every few days the sleep gets later. So what we're actually seeing is we're seeing kind of that evidence of having that longer circadian clock, that longer molecular clock closer to 25 hours. Because what we see is this person kind of flips over a day. This person kind of loses a day about every few weeks, right? So every 30 days, this person loses 24 hours from their circadian rhythm. And if we were to do the math, what we would calculate is that means this person has a molecular clock, or instead of a circadian rhythm of 24 hours, it's 25 hours and 15 minutes, which is longer. That adds up with our data about the morningness, eveningness questionnaire and how that affects the molecular clock. And so the current leading idea is that this phenotype is caused by a gain of function mutation in cryptochrome 1, one of those clock genes we've been talking about. Basically, cryptochrome is too good at sticking around. It's too good at not letting the body degrade it so the clock can move on and keep working. And so it just kind of hangs out in the nucleus for longer than it should, or in the cell for longer than it should. And that extends the molecular clock, which in turn manifests behaviorally as affecting the sleep-wake cycle. So recent development in chronobiology, just to give you an example of kind of how this field is developing, right, is the military just gave a lot of money to Northwestern University to have them create a chip that will be implanted in soldiers' bodies that will reset their circadian rhythms. Basically, this uses synthetic biology. It uses kind of that molecular stuff that we talked about, because what's so cool about chronobiology is that it goes from the very tiny things you can only see under strong microscopes, the molecular, to things that are not only behavioral but global, right? Things like that zooplankton moving throughout the day, right? Things that are big and broad. It's just a big field. And it's really all about connecting that small to that big. And so this is one of those examples that kind of does. This is a potential treatment, and basically the contract says that Northwestern will try to produce this device within 5 years of now, and it's going to respond to different light that the organism or the human, the soldier, is sensing, and it will accordingly release different proteins from cells that will help the molecular clock reset. So why are some people less sensitive to melatonin supplement is one of the first questions that I have from Siva. I'm so sorry. Please tell me how to pronounce your name. Is it short or long? Siva, thank you so much. So Siva asks us a question about melatonin. And basically it's because everybody has different genes. Everybody has different biology. It's the same reason why one person might be more sensitive to alcohol than another. It's because the things in their body that respond to it are shaped differently. Now, there's also people, I kind of like to hypothesize that circadian rhythms exist on something of a matrix, right? So, or something of a scale. So I'm going to turn on annotate, and I'm just going to draw real quick. So we kind of have, I can't draw a straight line to save my life. If you imagine like a graph, right? So on one hand, right, we have morningness and eveningness, and that's what I just talked about. And this is a facet of chronotype, right? Do you wake up earlier or wake up later? But then what I'd also like to hypothesize is we have a spectrum of flexibility. So on one hand here, we have more inflexible or rigid circadian rhythms, and these are less adaptable. It's harder to entrain them. And on the bottom, we have more flexible circadian rhythms. So they respond better to light, they respond better to melatonin. And so, for example, as someone with a non-24-hour sleep disorder, I would be kind of right here, right? So I'm extremely evening and my circadian rhythm is relatively unchangeable. So I like to kind of imagine that that's how that works. I think that's one of the easiest ways to explain biological flexibility. And again, it has a lot to do with genes. Does anybody have another question? Could a person train themselves to be nocturnal? Well, yes, right? A person can wake up then, a person can eat food then, someone's bacteria could adjust to it. They could go to work, shift work, like a security guard or something. And they could take melatonin to, like from a pill to override whatever their body's doing. They could even try to make the room colder when they're supposed to go to bed and make themselves hotter when they're not supposed to. So a person, and light therapy, right? You can wear blue blocking glasses when you're not supposed to be asleep. So a person can do all these things, but the question is all of your physiology going to keep up? And what we see right now is that that doesn't really happen, right? So even though behaviorally, you can of course do a lot to kind of train yourself to be nocturnal, not every cell in your body is quite keeping up. And that's why we see shift workers get diabetes or shift workers get Alzheimer's, things like that, right? So yeah, kind of hard, right? How much physiology can we override? And we don't really know right now. We don't really know if the molecular clock is kind of what's responsible, right? So do shift workers get all these problems because their molecular clock isn't adjusted, right? Maybe, maybe not. What body processes happen when you sleep? Is there a way to replace sleep with another process? Yes, so your body does a lot while you sleep. It has a lot of neurological stuff going on. So first of all, it's really important for your body to it's kind of like how you should shut down your computer every once in a while to reset things. And so you're consolidating memories. Your brain is, different cells are building themselves to connect to other cells, which is really important. Your body is also kind of cleaning the waste out of your brain. It's also really important for different processes in your body to be happening at different times, right? So it's an absolute waste of energy for your body to be at full capacity 24 hours a day, right? That takes so much energy, and I'm talking like food, nutrition, ATP, all that good stuff, right? So to have that select period where your body doesn't need to do that, really great. How much can a person need for such a training, rounding, and averaging? Can you clarify your question just a little bit? How much of what? Or like how much can a person do? Okay, so I'm going back to this slide. So basically, being the own boss on your circadian rhythm is about maximizing the effects of all of these inputs and outputs. And this is how we treat circadian rhythm disorders. So you want to restrict your access to light, meaning that basically if you have to be nocturnal to adjust to that circadian rhythm of another country virtually, distance-wise, then what you're going to want to do is ensure that you're not exposed to light during the time when you're supposed to be sleeping, and you are exposed to light when you're supposed to be awake. So something that you can do is you can order a light therapy box. They're really cheap now on Amazon. And yeah, so you can do that, and you can order glasses. They're blue blocking glasses. I should get mine out to demonstrate next time I teach this class, and make sure that you're not being exposed to light when you shouldn't be. Another thing is you can go buy melatonin at the store, and you can take melatonin at the time when your body is supposed to have the most of it. What you can also do is the times that you eat are a really big influence. So you want to make sure that you are only eating during like the first 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours of when you're supposed to be awake, and you're not eating after that. That's a big reason why we see people with shift work disorder developing metabolic disorder like diabetes. It's because they're eating at times that are mismatched with their circadian rhythm. Now, of course, there are dangers is maybe the wrong word, but functionally you would be one of those shift workers, right? So it's not necessarily the best thing to do biologically, but with the demands of the society we live in, it's something that everybody kind of has to face. Some people have great energy levels and function during the day with a few hours of sleep. Others function with 10 hours of sleep. Again, that actually has only some overlap with chronobiology. Basically, it has more to do with, is your sleep-wake cycle, like in practice, actually according to the right times of when your body wants it to be, when your circadian rhythm, your chronotype wants it to be. And so that's one reason why someone could not have a lot of energy, right? Basically, 3 hours of sleep in alignment with your chronotype could be better and is better than 10 hours of sleep out of alignment with your chronotype. So that's how chronobiology could affect that. Also, again, it's just kind of different strokes for different folks. Your mileage may vary. Basically, everybody has a unique set of genes that encode a unique set of differently shaped proteins and bodily structures. And because of how that works, things can be different for each person. Okay, and at that, we are going to adjourn for the day. I hope I will see some of the rest of you at Rainstorm. I hope you guys have a good time at Rainstorm. Hop over to that Discord, have some fun, play some games, eat some lunch, get pumped for your next classes. And yeah, I just hope you guys have a really good time. Thanks everyone for coming to this class. It's a real treat for me to be able to teach chronobiology to people. This field basically didn't exist before I was born. And as I've told you, someone with a circadian rhythm disorder myself, it affects every minute of my life. So it's really cool to potentially teach you guys who could be, you know, one of the next researchers someday. Like the Nobel Prize a couple years ago was just awarded for chronobiology. So very new field. All right. Hope you guys have a good rest of your weekend. Thanks for coming.